How the hell do we wind up like this?
When people hear the word homelessness, they tend to get very uncomfortable. That's because it's such a complex issue. We cannot seem to pinpoint what the exact cause of it is, and because we do not know who or what is exactly to blame, we are not sure who holds the responsibility for fixing the problem. And because there are so many different perspectives, there are many different views on what is the best way to end homelessness. Let's take a sociological exploration of these different perspectives. The first issue that comes to mind when trying to figure out the cause of homelessness is poverty. However, poverty is a problem in of itself. To identify this fact is to substantiate the claim that Paula S. Rothenberg makes in her book entitled What's the Problem? That these issues in our world are not the initial problems, but rather symptoms of much larger problems. The woman in this picture didn't end up on the street solely because of her individual actions, but because of where she was born and what family she was born into. Place and social class matter when it comes to poverty because according to John Witt in his book entitled The Big Picture, these factors determine the resources to which you do or do not have accessible to you. So wealth will create more wealth while those who lack wealth will struggle to survive. Although this pattern is typical, movement up and down this social ladder that we have socially constructed for ourselves can happen the other way too. If those at the top fail in some way, they may fall to the bottom, whereas people in poor circumstances such as Oprah Winfrey may be able to work hard enough and persevere to that higher position in society. But issues of unemployment complicate matters for these people. According to the fact sheet on employment by the National Coalition for the Homeless, the economy has lost nearly 6 million jobs since the recession began in December 2007. Household Survey reports that the unemployment rate increased from 8.9% to 9.5% in June 2009, which, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, added over 750,000 workers to the unemployed list. Furthermore, if and when these people find a new job, they are typically paid around 13% less than in their old job. Issues of discrimination also arise here. When homeless people apply for a job, they cannot put an address on their application, and that immediately puts them below other people in an employer's mind. This discrimination is worsened when other factors are taken into consideration, such as race and gender. According to Witt, although it is against the law for employers to discriminate based on these factors, African Americans and other minorities as well as women typically have a harder time finding a job than whites and men. Furthermore, in our society of ever-growing income and wealth gaps, these people are at the bottom end. A lack of education can add to the stress of trying to find a job. More and more children are becoming homeless, which makes it infinitely harder for them to go to school. According to the fact sheet on education by the National Coalition for the Homeless, residency requirements, guardianship requirements, delays in transfer of school records, lack of transportation, and lack of immunization records often prevent homeless children from enrolling in school. As a result, they do not have the skills necessary for good-paying jobs. These conditions are worse in inner cities populated by lower-class minorities simply because they lack resources. Witt supports this argument because he said that schools help to maintain inequalities that already exist in society by controlling the curriculum and the educational setting. Tracking or placing students in classes and programs with other students based on perceived similarities of ability may seem like a good idea, but because students are seeing themselves in a lower level class, they fail out of a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the other hand, some may argue that education has nothing to do with getting a job. There are plenty of college graduates out there who are more than qualified, but they are still unemployed because of the lack of available jobs. So which problem is causing homelessness? The lack of jobs or the lack of education? When people are living in poverty, they need an affordable place to live. This brings us to our next possible cause of homelessness: lack of affordable housing. According to a fact sheet on military spending by the National Coalition for the Homeless, in 2010, the Department of Housing and Urban Development had a budget of $46.3 billion. Conversely, the Department of Defense's budget was $533.7 billion. This smaller budget reflects the reason why, according to John Barrymore in an article entitled How Section 8 Housing Works, only 25% of qualifying families receive housing. On the flip side, this may seem unfair, but maybe there is a point to the distribution of this money. For instance, if we got everyone out of homelessness, our culture as we know it would begin to disintegrate. In Witt's book, he described Karl Marx's view on society. Jobs are de-skilled so that companies can pay them low wages and maximize production. But if everyone had a home, saved money, and went to college, there wouldn't be any place for these low-paying jobs and corporate America would falter. This would even make people who are disadvantaged by corporate America uncomfortable because that is all we know. We socially construct culture because, as Witt says, it gives us order, meaning, and direction that we lack biologically. A change would take away this comfort we have created for ourselves. The next issue that may be the cause of homelessness is mental illness. It all started with the 1963 Community Mental Health Centers Act when the government attempted to shift the responsibility of mental health patients from the state level to the federal level. But when it came down to it, the federal government could not provide the states with the money they promised for the community mental health centers. Before this was known to the states, hospitals started deinstitutionalizing their mental health patients. Then, when these people went to the mental health centers, there was not enough space for all of them and they ended up out on the streets. Lillian B. Rubin has a very strong opinion about the cause of homelessness as she expresses it in her article in Rothenberg's book, What's the Problem?, entitled Sandcastles and Snake Pits. She says that homelessness isn't an accident or an artifact of some strange modern urban disease, but a product of failed social policy. This issue goes along with the lack of affordable health care as well. A family could be living in poverty and still have housing, but if they have one health emergency, they will end up on the street because they cannot afford treatment. These issues go back to the issue of inequality and the uneven distribution of money and resources. As you can see, the nice cars in the parking lot of this hospital indicate that people living in poverty probably cannot afford to go here for treatment. If everyone had access to the same resources and we didn't have our class system, perhaps people wouldn't go homeless. Now we come to the infamous connection between homelessness and addiction. One perspective is that addiction causes homelessness. It is easy to see how a crack addict or an alcoholic could go homeless because they are not being socially integrated. They aren't paying attention to their families, their jobs, or anyone else that may depend on them. In Witt's book, he described Durkheim's particular interest in the effects of individualism. When people cut themselves off from society, they have no sense of community, no collective conscience, and no sense of mutual responsibility. Because it has been proven that no one can survive in this world on their own because of our strong interdependence, logically, an addict would lose all of their resources. On the other hand, some argue that homelessness causes addiction. Because of how social human beings are, when someone is cut off from the world the way a homeless person is, the only way to stay sane is by drinking and doing drugs. Plus, it is easily accessible to them because other homeless people sell it to make money, and the parts of town they tend to reside in have more liquor stores and bars than they do convenience stores and restaurants. So should addiction be a concern when considering the causes of homelessness or not? Lastly, we come to domestic violence as one of the possible causes of homelessness. The majority of the victims are women, and Kathy Cheney says in an article that domestic violence hits black women harder than whites. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, domestic violence causes the victim to miss too many days of work and they lose their income. Then if and when they decide to leave their abuser, they have nowhere to go. Waiting lists on homeless shelters are often far too long, and more often than not, the abuser has cut the victim off from their social resources, so the victim lacks social integration much like an addict and is often left all alone. Now let's move on to possible responses to homelessness. Should we try to end it? Who is we? How should we go about doing it? One response has been criminalization. Something we often do by human nature is ignore problems, concluding that they will eventually solve themselves, much like we do with racism and gender stereotypes. Witt says we are so caught up in making sure people know that we are not to blame for the issue that we end up dismissing it altogether because we are so consumed by the concept of the looking glass self and constantly trying to figure out how other people see and judge us. So by outlawing common practices of the homeless population, maybe they won't be able to support themselves in any way other than reintegrating themselves back into society. Another response is just to leave them alone. If they aren't helping themselves, why should we try to do anything for them? Even after they are given money sometimes and shown how to do things differently to be more successful, they blow it on drugs, alcohol, and frivolities like in the picture you see here. Plus, if you look deeper into the lives of homeless people, you'll see that they create communities for themselves. For example, in the documentary about a group of homeless people living in the subways of New York entitled Dark Days, you'll see that they are fairly happy people, especially the man you see here. He says he loves being able to leave the TV on all night and not having to pay a bill for it. Plus, it's easy to find things that are brand new in the garbage that he can sell. They have each other, warmth, comfort, good food, and one of them even says, after Amtrak came down telling them they have 30 days to evacuate, to just leave us alone. Lastly, we have the option to help them help themselves. For example, this book describes different policies being instated to help make it easier for homeless children to get an education. Also, a nonprofit organization sponsors the production of The Big Issue, a newspaper distributed by homeless people for money. However, both of these efforts are questioned as to whether or not they are genuine. Another thing we can do is obtain government support, as this man here is trying to say. More and more, homeless people are not looking to be coddled, they are looking for a change. Given all these different perspectives, if the problem of homelessness is ultimately something we decide we want to try to end, how are we going to do it? Would it be better to take a macro approach and find out how society is causing it, or the micro approach and see how individual action causes it? Such questions illustrate just how complex the problem of homelessness is.